Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take a stack of dense historical sources, chroniclers who were there, military analysts who've mapped the field, and really extract the crucial insights into a moment of, well, pure improbable genius.
And today we are focusing on one of the most remarkable, just decisive tactical victories in the entire history of the Crusader states.
A battle that, when you look at it on paper, really should never have been won.
We are diving deep into the Battle of Montgisard, fought on November 25, 1177. And if you just look at the raw numbers, the historical setup, it almost defies belief.
It really does.
Yeah.
On one side, you have arguably the greatest leader of the age, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria.
And he's marching with an immense unified Ayyuban army. The estimates we have put it anywhere between, say, 20,000 and 26,000 soldiers. A massive force.
An enormous force. And on the other side, you have the fractured, fragile kingdom of Jerusalem, led by a king who was, he was barely an adult.
Baldwin IV. He was only 16 years old and already severely afflicted by this aggressive form of leprosy.
And the force he commands is just a cobbled-together group that, by most contemporary and modern estimates, numbered maybe, 3,000 to 4,500 men in total?
At the absolute most. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario, a battle where the odds of victory were, for all intents and purposes, zero.
Right. So the sources from the Frankish side, people like William of Tyre, they frame it as a miracle, an act of God.
Of course they do. But when we look closer, when we really synthesize all the material, we realize this wasn't pure luck or divine intervention.
It was something else.
It was a perfect storm. It was calculated strategic deception, the sheer audacious physical courage of this young king, and, maybe most critically, a catastrophic overconfidence that completely blinded Saladin's leadership.
So our thesis is clear. Montgisard was this momentary, violent shift in the balance of power. It was a strategic disaster for Saladin that bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem a decade, a crucial decade of time.
A respite, exactly. It allowed the kingdom to survive its worst internal political struggles, even though, as we'll definitely get into later, the long-term legacy of this victory is, well, it's tragically complicated.
And to figure this out, we'll be synthesizing accounts from both sides. We have William of Tyre, who was Baldwin's former tutor, writing the Historia. He gives us that Frankish perspective.
But we're balancing that with the perspectives from, the Mamluk and Ayyubid courts, historians like Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani and Ibn al-Athir. And then we're layering on top of that modern military analysis that helps us understand the terrain, the doctrine, all of it.
Our mission then is to uncover how leadership, timing, and just sheer defiance managed to turn the tide in what seemed like a completely hopeless circumstance, and what role the severely ill King Baldwin IV really played in this unbelievable triumph.
To truly appreciate the scale of what happened at Montgisard, we have to start with the state of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. You have to understand the internal rot.
It was not a healthy state.
Not at all. It was an institutionally weak state, constantly relying on new waves of external aid from Europe. It was facing this deep structural and political decline.
And that decline was, in many ways, personified in the young king himself, Baldwin IV. He comes to the throne at 13, and by 16, he's already facing the full, debilitating reality of leprosy.
And the diagnosis had been confirmed years earlier. There's that famous story from his tutor, William of Tyre, who noticed that the young prince, during a game with other boys, wasn't reacting to being pinched on his right arm.
He'd lost all sensation.
He'd lost sensation, and that was the first sign. The progressive nature of his illness is just. It's crucial to understanding the state of the kingdom. While he was highly intelligent and very well educated, William of Tyre saw to that. His condition was physically devastating.
So what were those specific constraints, especially for a medieval king, a commander who was expected to lead from the front? We have this image of him as frail, but the sources suggest he kept this one formidable skill.
The ability to ride, it's remarkable. The chroniclers are very specific about his physical challenges.
Yeah.
The inability to use his right arm, and eventually his hands needed to be bandaged and supported.
But he could still command a warhorse.
Exceptionally well. William of Tyre notes, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he became more skilled than men who were older than himself in controlling horses and in riding them at a gallop. He had to learn to manage his mount almost entirely with his knees and a specialized saddle. He was compensating for his physical limits with pure will and technique. And he had to be in control because the king's presence in battle was essential for morale.
That's such a powerful image. A king whose greatest asset is his mind, forced to master this huge, powerful animal through sheer will. But that same illness, his leprosy, it created the political crisis that Saladin was banking on
The succession issue. It was the single greatest political vulnerability the kingdom had.
because he couldn't have an heir.
He couldn't sire an heir. So the future of the dynasty was constantly in doubt. The question in every court in the Levant and in Europe wasn't if Baldwin would die, but when, and who would take the throne after him. This instability was like a constant high-volume signal of terminal decline to external powers.
So Saladin's calculation wasn't just about military might, it was psychological. He's thinking, why should I commit to a total, costly, immediate conquest when I know the internal clock of the Franks is counting down to collapse anyway?
Precisely. This structural vulnerability gave Saladin the luxury of strategic patience. He could just apply sustained pressure, probe the borders, knowing that the internal politics and the eventual death of the king would likely hand him the kingdom on much easier terms.
And yet, those internal politics were almost as destructive as Saladin's external pressure. You have this constant corrosive factionalism.
It was an operational nightmare. I mean, you had two radically opposed visions for the kingdom's survival, constantly at each other's throats.
Let's break those down. First, you have the pragmatists.
Yes, the pragmatic faction, or the court party, often led by the experienced and, relatively level-headed Raymond III of Tripoli. They favored maintaining truces, diplomacy, stability.
They understood the numbers game.
They understood the demographic reality. They knew the Franks simply couldn't afford constant, high-cost warfare. They were a tiny minority in a hostile land.
And then you have their mirror image, the hardline militaristic faction, the Hawks.
The war party. And they were the ones who ultimately caused so much trouble. This was the aggressively war-hungry faction, most notoriously personified by Raynald of Châtillon, the Lord of Ultra-Jourdain.
We'll be talking a lot more about him.
Oh, yes. They advocated for relentless, uncompromising war against Saladin. For them, violating truces was almost a matter of principle.
And this internal rivalry, pragmatism versus hawkishness, it just consistently undermined any chance of a unified long-term strategy.
Which is exactly what a small kingdom facing a massive unified threat so desperately needed.
Okay, let's pivot and look at the architect of that threat. Saladin. By 1177, he wasn't just another commander. He was a political and religious force in his own right.
He was a phenomenon. After consolidating his power by taking Damascus in 1174, he established himself as the Sultan of both Egypt and Syria, founding the Ayyubid dynasty.
But his ultimate objective was always the expulsion of the Crusaders, right?
Of course. That was the grand project. But his immediate strategic reality was a bit more complex. He still had powerful Muslim rivals to deal with.
Aleppo, Mosul, they weren't exactly on his side yet.
Not at all. They were major threats to his unified front. So Saladin needed to demonstrate that he was the rightful dominant regional power. And he did this by meticulously, carefully cultivating an image as the dedicated defender and champion of Sunni Islam.
That image was his political capital.
It was. It allowed him to draw on the religious and financial support necessary to tackle his long-term goal. But the 1177 campaign, we have to be clear, it wasn't just a holy war. It was geopolitics.
So if he launches this massive invasion, what's the core strategic aim beyond just land and plunder?
It was preemptive pressure. It was a high-stakes move. The invasion was intended to cripple the Kingdom of Jerusalem financially and militarily, for sure. But more importantly, it was meant to send a message.
A message to whom?
To potential allies of the Franks, especially the powerful Byzantine Empire. He wanted to demonstrate to Constantinople and to the powers in Western Europe that the Crusader kingdom was utterly indefensible. It was a lost cause.
And if he could convince them of that, he could then turn his full attention to his Muslim rivals.
Exactly. He could focus all his resources on absorbing Mosul and Aleppo without having to worry about a major, externally funded Frankish-Byzantine coalition attacking his Egyptian power base.
Which brings us to the immediate catalyst, the event that literally threw open the gates for Saladin's invasion.
The disastrous, failed Byzantine-Frankish plan to invade Egypt.
This is a textbook example of politics getting in the way of a good plan.
It's a perfect example of political intransigence overriding military necessity. Baldwin IV, who was thinking strategically, and the Byzantine Emperor, Manuelis Komnenos, had planned this massive, coordinated naval and land attack on Egypt itself, Saladin's power base.
And the Byzantines were bringing the fleet.
A huge war fleet. They were providing the vast majority of the naval power. Everything was set. And then Philip of Alsace, the Count of Flanders, arrived with his own large force from Europe.
But he brought his own agenda, a ruinous agenda, as it turns out.
The sources are clear on this. Philip's political ambition completely undermined the entire strategy. He didn't want to conquer territory for the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
He wanted his own kingdom.
He insisted that he be crowned king of any territory they conquered in Egypt. And this demand was just wholly unacceptable to Baldwin IV. It challenged the sovereignty of his own kingdom. And it was equally unacceptable to the Byzantines, who were providing the fleet and were not about to hand over the spoils of war to some ambitious French count.
So because of one man's political demands, this grand coalition that could have potentially decapitated Saladin's power base in Egypt just collapses.
It completely disintegrated. The Byzantine fleet, seeing all the political infighting and the lack of commitment, just withdrew. They took their naval superiority with them.
And then the Frankish army does something even more foolish.
Convinced that the Egypt plan was now impossible, the crucial Frankish forces that had gathered, including key military manpower led by Raymond of Tripoli, they just divert north to attack Haram in Syria.
So they leave the entire southern frontier of the kingdom completely exposed.
Dangerously exposed. And this creates the perfect storm for Saladin. He had already mobilized his massive Egyptian army to repel the invasion he was expecting.
And now he gets word that the entire Frankish strategic reserve has abandoned the south and gone hundreds of miles north.
It was an intelligence gift, a golden opportunity. Saladin recognized the strategic vacuum immediately. The sources call it a splendid opportunity. He had his army mobilized, paid, and ready to fight. And suddenly, the heart of the enemy kingdom, the road to Jerusalem, was wide open.
And he didn't hesitate.
Not for a second. He struck immediately on November 18th, gambling on minimal resistance along the coast. The very factionalism that plagued the Crusader nobility had just handed him the chance for their total destruction.
Let's nail down the sheer scale of this military imbalance on the eve of Montgisard, because it really does frame the subsequent events as truly unbelievable.
The numbers are just staggering. As we said, estimates from both Frankish and Arab chroniclers place the Ayyubid host somewhere between 20 and 26,000 men.
And William of Tyre, who was in the region, specifically claimed 26,000 light horse.
Which is probably an exaggeration, but the point stands. What matters even more than the exact count, though, is the composition of that army.
Right. It wasn't just a mass of infantry. This was a modern, mobile, highly effective fighting force.
It was incredibly sophisticated for the period. Saladin's army was predominantly cavalry, built on mobility and missile power. You had the elite Mamluk heavy cavalry, who were these well-armored, highly trained, disciplined slave soldiers. They often served as Saladin's core shock troops and his personal bodyguard.
And then the horse archers.
The essential Turkic horse archers. They were the key. They could skirmish, harass, and effectively dismantle enemy formations from a distance without ever having to commit to close combat. And then, of course, you had Sudanese and Kurdish infantry providing the necessary Balkan line defense.
So their entire strategy was the exact opposite of the Franks. It was all about mobility, overwhelming numbers, and missile attrition to wear down the heavily armored, slower European knights.
Absolutely. Their strength lay in their ability to maneuver, to surround, to pepper the enemy with arrows until the Frankish shock troops were exhausted or scattered or exposed.